G'day and welcome to Does It Matter? I've been reading a lot lately about habituation, hedonic adaptation, these neuroscientific discoveries about our nature and how we get used to anything, bad, good, we adapt to things, and how that correlates to our need for novelty or the introduction of new patterns, new stimuli, new things, new behaviours, etc., etc. And I found myself fundamentally disagreeing with the neuroscientist I was listening to about one point, where she said there was no difference between men and women that she knew in the literature. And one, she's not correct. There is some literature that highlights some differences. It's not much, but there is some between men and women. So there's not a lot of study on whether men and women are different in their habituation patterns. And do they need different levels of novelty, or what's the pace of that adoption of novelty in relationships and in groups? And the thing that seems to present itself over and over again to me, having trained people in groups, worked with people in groups for decades, is that, and talking to lots and lots of people in relationships, is that there is a profound difference between men and women when it comes to habituation in certain respects. One of the things I've noticed, if you're talking about a group or a relationship, is that men seem to accept the status quo of the dominance hierarchy they're in for longer, i.e. there's less shoulder rubbing, there's less jostling for position than there is with women. But when there is, it's often quite pronounced, it's quite strong, okay? Usually for good reasons, or reasons that individuals feel are good. So the dominance hierarchies in men are steeper, there's more layers of seniority, and they're more rigid. And to work your way up that dominance hierarchy, you needed to be cool with being in a place for a while. You needed to be cool with things being the same for a while, status quo. It's why men are more status orientated, even more status orientated than women on average. And that's one of the reasons, is because we get stuck in status hierarchies for significantly longer often on a historical perspective. Women had and have always had more egalitarian hierarchies. So even when there's a hierarchy, and there often is with women as well as men, it's a less steep hierarchy, it's a more egalitarian hierarchy, it's more consultative. Now this varies from culture to culture. The Norwegians and Scandinavians have always had a more consultative, more egalitarian dominance hierarchy, but it was also an extremely violent dominance hierarchy with holmgangs and things like that, fights to the death and to the first blood and so on and so on. So you don't see that in general amongst women. You just don't. What you see is a much more common swapping of ideas, a much more common shifting of positions in women's social hierarchies. Okay? Less violently too. So what it looks like to me, and this is my theory, and I'm welcome anyone to suggest otherwise or present other evidence, I'm more than interested in hearing it, is that women's groups, as they formed over hundreds of thousands of years and our brains evolved and changed, those groups habituated women to a higher level of frequency change, i.e. they had to change their minds more often. They had to at least change position within their hierarchies more often, and they had to change and be introduced to new ideas more often. They also were, because they were protected to some degree by the village, by the palisade, by the men, they could afford to play with ideas like we can today in our more affluent culture with far less existential threats. We can play with all kinds of nonsense ideas. The world's awash in woke and other nonsense ideas mixed in with the good ideas. We've got lots of stupid ideas mixed in with our good ideas because we can afford that. We have the luxury of having an environment that tolerates that. And women were more protected even back in the hunter-gatherer days, and they were able to then play with more ideas. It was a really good thing, and I don't think human civilization would have been what it is today without that. So, but they also had a lot more stupid ideas, a lot more flimsy ideas that wouldn't hold up in real life. And that might also explain the frequency of hierarchy changes. Women over hundreds of thousands of years have gotten used to a very different rate of habituation and a very different rate of novelty. And it's why I think that men seek out novelty no less than women, probably more than women. I would argue that from the evidence I've seen that men seek out novelty more than women, but they are habituated to quite the opposite because of the rigidity and steepness of the dominance hierarchies they're trapped in, and the fucking risk. If you push up and you don't get seniority, the guy that you failed against and all his mates on that pier, they're going to crush you even harder. It's a big risk to push up that way. It can cost you your life, and it can certainly lead your life becoming utterly miserable. And loss of social status was almost death in some circumstances, in some tribes. So, as much as men might want novelty more, and they do, they don't expect it more. Whereas women in the more egalitarian groups actually have a reasonable expectation that their ideas will be listened to. It's why I suspect women need to be heard more than men. They need to be listened to more than men. They have that need more than men do, because they functioned in hierarchies where that was actually the rule, not the exception. And as a result, their need for novelty, for the inception of new ideas, new stimuli, is higher than men's is. Right? Ironically, men's desire for novelty is even higher than women's, probably because we don't get it anywhere near as often as women do in their own social hierarchies. It's a fascinating idea that I've been playing with for probably over a year, a bit over a year now, and I'm finding ample evidence to support it. Not a lot of clinical evidence. I guess it's not attracting the kind of funding that it deserves, but there's a lot of literature in anthropology, evolutionary psychology that actually supports the idea that rates of habituation are different between men and women, and it's due to the anthropological differences in our evolution as we move through very different, parallel but different dominance hierarchies, and how we're related to one another. The costs, opportunity costs of trying to move up. The opportunity costs for women are much, much less than the opportunity costs for men in trying to shift through the dominance hierarchy. A man who wants to do it peacefully can do it peacefully. It takes a lot longer. He'll be very old by the time he gets anywhere. Okay, and some men did do that, and there's a whole culture within the male dominance hierarchies of that, of going, don't cause trouble, move up slowly through competence. Okay. Other men are disruptors and will do the opposite. And there's certainly there's female equivalents of that, but this you don't see in the literature, you don't see in tribal studies of existing hunter-gatherer and nomadic tribes. You just don't see the same levels of conflict between the women as you do between the men. You don't see it. You see much more frequent conflict with women, but it's at a much lower level, much less violent level and less costly. So when there's a lower opportunity cost, the people within that particular group are incentivized to keep arguing, keep debating, keep fighting, keep jostling. And so it's actually a rich milieu for ideas to emerge. And I do wonder sometimes how many of our better ideas actually emerge from the female groups as opposed to the male groups. No way of verifying that, but from a logical point of view, I suspect that a lot of the ideas that came from humanity that evolved us into the agrarian and civilized state may well have come from the female groups, sort of osmosing it through to the men, at least in some part. Okay, it's just a theory of mine, but it's an idea that, you know, if you're freer to think, freer to play with, you know, fantastic and imaginative thinking, some ideas, some very novel ideas, are going to make their way through the milieu. So one worth thinking about. But yeah, I really do honestly think that one of the big differences between men and women today has evolved because of those differences in our dominance hierarchies and our evolution. And it's why a guy can be satisfied with the status quo forever. Like he can fucking missionary for the next 3 weeks and, you know, change a couple of positions and be happy. Some women are very unhappy with that and need a lot more than that. And he can eat the same food 3 days in a row, and I know I can. Most women I know will go nuts if you try to feed them the same thing 3 days in a row, and that's fair enough. And I think there's an evolutionary reason for it. I think there's evolutionary reasons for most of what we are. And I think that's an interesting one. Open for discussion. Us.